Our short study today looks at Joshua chapter 14. After chapter 13 confirms possession of the lands east of the Jordan to the Reubenites, Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, the next 6 chapters describe the allocation of the land to the remaining 9.5 tribes. Emphasis falls upon the fact that this inheritance is in the land of Canaan, the territory that was specifically promised by the Lord to his people. Wisely, the various areas were assigned by lot, in order to ensure that allegations of bias were avoided, and they were supervised by the ecclesiastical, military and political leaders, Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans. Here was no free-for-all. Overarching all this is that the division of the land was undertaken, as we are told, just as the Lord had commanded through Moses. By now we're familiar with the way the author keeps us waiting. Once again, just as we expect to be told the details of the allocation, we're reintroduced to Caleb in verses 6 to 15. What is particularly interesting is the way this story fits in the larger context. Caleb was one of the 2 spies who had demonstrated faith in the Lord's ability to give the Israelites the land. Now he receives his own inheritance. Then at the end of chapter 19 we're told how Joshua, the other faithful spy, received his territory. Thus the 2 accounts of the Lord's faithfulness to these 2 old men begin and close this section of the book. At the same time there is also a short break between chapters 17 and 18 that is signalled by the new start in chapter 18 verse 1, where we're told the whole assembly of the Israelites gathered. In the light of this we notice that chapter 17 ends with the complaints of the Ephraimites, whom Joshua encourages to take the hill country. This suggests Caleb and the Ephraimites are being offered as counter-examples. However, Joshua, also an Ephraimite, takes the hill country for himself at the end of chapter 19. Thus his story is a counterpoint to the failure of his own tribe. All in all then, this is a very clever piece of writing that helps us to acknowledge the author's focus. The vividness of the story suggests that it may well have been recounted by an eyewitness. It introduces us to an old man of 85, compare verses 7 and 10, who recalls that 45 years previously he had followed the Lord wholeheartedly, when others had made the hearts of the people melt away with fear, by emphasizing the difficulties rather than looking to the Lord. We find this referred to in verse 8. On that occasion, Caleb had been promised the land on which your feet have walked. To many this would have been something of a 2-edged promise. He'd actually visited the territory of the giant Anakites, before whom the other spies had trembled. However, just as the Lord had kept him alive, so that he was just as vigorous to go out to battle as I was then, so his faith had burned bright throughout the years. Thus in verse 12 he asks, "Give me this hill country that the Lord promised to me that day, and I will drive them out." Under the blessing of Joshua on account of his wholehearted obedience, Caleb entered his inheritance. We shall discover how this was achieved later. Here it's described as though it was simplicity itself, despite the fact that Abba, who was the greatest of men among the Anakites, lived there, as we're reminded in verse 14. Thus, after years of weary wandering, of incessant toil and ceaseless conflict, of unfulfilled hopes, Caleb's faith had burned bright and had reaped its reward. Thus we're told in verse 15 he experienced peace, the full experience of all those blessings that accompany the end of hostility and the enjoyment of the promises of God.